Rob, Tracy, can you turn on your webcams? Hello, everybody, and welcome. Happy Monday. So my name is Ashley. I'm CalRecycle's SB 1383 Implementation Manager, and I want to welcome everyone to the first of our 5 webinars where we're going to go over the model tools for 1383. So for this webinar, we're going to focus on an overview of all the tools, and Rob Hilton from HF&H will be presenting on it. Please note that these webinars are being recorded, and the PowerPoints and webinars will be posted after they're converted for ADA compliance. We will also be taking live questions, fingers crossed it works, at the end of each presentation. So if you have a question, you should be signed in through the GoTo link. In that GoTo, platform, there's a chat feature. Please put an asterisk in the chat feature and we'll call on you to ask your question. In order to be the most effective, please keep all questions focused on the model tools. For other questions not related to the model tools, feel free to either contact your local assistance representative or email the SLCP inbox. Before we dive into the presentation, I would like to thank HF&H, Deborah Kaufman Consulting and Diversion Strategies for developing the model tools. And also I would like to thank our resource groups as well as all the CalRecycle staff who contributed to the tools. So now I'd like to introduce Rob Hilton. Since 2002, Mr. Hilton has provided recycling and solid waste consulting services to public agencies covering a range of strategic, operational, programmatic, contractual, and financial issues. Rob leads HF&H's franchising team, supporting over a dozen communities annually in competitively procuring and negotiating collection, processing, or disposal contracts. Rob leads HF&H's SB 1383 efforts, including direction over 20 SB 1383 projects, such as SB 1383 implementation plans, compliant franchises, compliant ordinances, and the development of the CalRecycle Models Tools projects. He has also hosted several 1383 local government summits and has spoken many times to jurisdictions on SB 1383 compliance. So Rob, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. Well, good morning, everybody. We are really glad to be here today presenting these tools. It's been quite a while in the development, and we're really excited to have them out in everybody's hands and available for use as you're all working with implementation of 1383 locally. So as most of you know, SB 1383 is the most significant waste reduction mandate to be adopted in California in the last 30 years. And the legislation and the resulting regulations have significant policy and legal implications for local governments. To assist jurisdictions with the implementation of SB 1383, HF&H consultants in collaboration with Diversion Strategies and Deborah Kaufman work with CalRecycle to develop 4 model tools to provide support to jurisdictions and other regulated entities as they journey towards achieving SB 1383 compliance. The tools include a model franchise agreement, model mandatory organics disposal reduction ordinance, model organic waste product procurement policy for compost, mulch, renewable gas, energy from biomass, and recycled content paper, and a model edible food recovery agreement. In this presentation, we're going to provide an overview of each of the model tools, and then the other 4 presentations that are scheduled for this week go into detail about each of those. Before diving into the model tools, we're going to cover some background information on the SB 1383 regulations. So as you know, SB 1383 establishes organic waste reduction targets. It builds on the mandatory commercial organics recycling law that California jurisdictions have been implementing since 2016. But SB 1383 sets a goal for Californians to reduce the disposal of organic waste 50% by 2020 and 75% by 2025. These targets are against the 2014 Waste Characterization Study measurement that estimated 23 million tons of organic waste were disposed in California. So these disposal reductions would reduce at least 8 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually by 2030. SB 1383 establishes an additional goal to recover 20% of currently disposed edible food for human consumption by 2025, as directed by the legislature as part of the overall disposal reduction targets. The 1383 definition of organic waste covers many materials such as food, paper, cardboard, green waste, and wood waste. Important to note that the regulations take effect in 2022. In SB 1383 terms, a jurisdiction is defined in the regulation to include cities and counties, in San Francisco's case, and special districts that provide solid waste handling services. To meet the regulatory deadline of January 2022, CalRecycle expects that jurisdictions will be planning and making programmatic and budgetary decisions regarding those requirements now. By 2022, jurisdictions are required to have an ordinance, and we'll be discussing that later in the presentation, have organics collection services for all residents and businesses up and running. Organic waste collection services are to be automatically provided to all residents and businesses if they generate organic waste. They are to implement edible food recovery programs established for Tier 1 generators by January of 22 and for Tier 2 generators by January of 24, and conduct compliant education and outreach. Local agencies need to procure recovered organic waste products and paper products, assess and plan for organic processing and edible food recovery capacity, and jurisdictions are to monitor by conducting desk audits, route reviews, and inspections of Tier 1 generators. During the first 2 years, jurisdictions will be providing education and outreach to any non-compliant generator. Note that CalRecycle can begin enforcement actions on jurisdictions and other entities starting in January of 2022. By January of 2024, jurisdictions will be required to take enforcement action against non-compliant entities. Note that jurisdictions are not required to impose penalties on generators found in violation of prohibited container contaminant requirements, but there are monetary penalties associated with other requirements of the law. CalRecycle has some funding available through competitive grant programs as well as a loan program for establishing infrastructure for organic waste and recovering edible food, but programmatic activities such as enforcement, inspections, education, collection services, each jurisdiction needs to plan for the budgetary and staffing changes to address those ongoing requirements. The big takeaway is jurisdictions need to start planning now, if they haven't already, to ramp up for the programmatic staffing and budgetary changes that are required by January of 2022. This is also a bit of an all-hands effort. The law is extending beyond just the waste management and recycling operations staff within a jurisdiction. So you're likely to engage city councils and boards of supervisors to pass ordinances. Those ordinances need to cover many activities, including requiring all residents and businesses to participate in the programs. You're likely to engage finance and legal staff in the ordinance process and in the rate setting process or staff budgeting process. Public works staff will be greatly involved in the franchise agreement process, as well as likely to leverage the model franchise agreement that we will be presenting. Purchasing staff will be central to implementing the procurement policy, as will public park staff, who may be responsible for finding a place for compost and mulch to be used within the community. Transportation and fleet departments might be involved in the procurement policy by procuring renewable natural gas for jurisdiction-owned vehicles. Environmental health staff may be tasked with some enforcement duties, and city managers and county administrative officers or county executive officers are going to be involved in coordinating the planning and activities among all of these agencies, really including all of the requirements of the law to make sure that they're fully implemented in each community. One slide too many. So now that we've got a better understanding of SB 1383's requirements, let's review how the model tools can help the regulated entities achieve compliance. The model franchise agreement addresses many 1383 requirements related to collection, processing, containers, contamination monitoring, and more. The model ordinance establishes enforceable SB 1383 related requirements for organic waste generators, haulers, and the other regulated entities under the law. The model procurement policy facilitates the procurement of recovered organic waste products and paper. And the model edible food recovery agreement assists jurisdiction in providing tools for commercial edible food generators and edible food recovery organizations, assists those commercial edible food generators with the requirement to have a contract or written agreement with a food recovery organization or service, and assists food recovery organizations and services by providing them with an agreement with their edible food generators. The tools were developed to support both jurisdictions and those other regulated entities that we've talked about with the planning, implementation, and compliance with SB 1383. They were developed over the course of about 6 months, and during that time, 3 resource groups comprised of industry experts reviewed the model tools and gave us feedback along the way. Those tools were then revised based on that great input that we got from the resource groups, and thank you again to them. And we've added into the model tools guidance and resources that will help users as they are working with the documents. Users can expect to have a better understanding of the regulations and compliance strategies through these guidance notes, and perhaps most importantly, the tools present some example provisions that can be lifted directly. Now, before I go any further, I want to touch on some of the fine print. The model tools are provided for example purposes only. They shouldn't be merely duplicated without considering each individual jurisdiction's particular needs and circumstances. While we cover a lot of different situations in this, it doesn't necessarily cover every possible situation, nor can it anticipate one-off specific needs that some communities may have. We've done our best to align the language in the models with the regulations, but in the event that there's a conflict between the model and the regulation, obviously the regulations prevail over any language in the model tools. In those cases, SB 1383 regulatory language in the official rulemaking record should guide determining the intent and interpretation. It's also important to note that each jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for its compliance with the regulations and is advised to seek legal counsel in the development or modification of the agreements and ordinances and tools that we've provided here to make them specific to your jurisdiction. All right, so with the disclaimer out of the way, let's dive in. As a way of introduction to the models, I'd like to provide a quick orientation to the approach we've taken to making the documents user-friendly and to explain how we've included guidance, customization options, and regulatory language in the document. So the models appear as fairly colorful documents. There are text highlights and colors as displayed on this slide that give some guidance and optionality. The guidance notes are highlighted in green and are integrated into the model tools to explain how specific sections and provisions of the model can be customized for a jurisdiction's needs. Additional information on 1383 regulations is embedded in many of these guidance notes to give specifics to the users. Notes in blue identify various options or areas where specific information is to be inserted or selected based on the design of a specific system. And SB 1383 specific content is shown in blue, and anything else that is added is shown in black. The SB 1383 specific content follows closely with the regulatory language. However, in many cases, the wording of the 1383 requirements were adapted to fit the context of the model agreement or model ordinance, conform with defined terms, or be framed with sufficient detail for the purposes of that tool. In most cases, the black font relates to 1383 requirements and is included to provide some context or specification to how the 1383 related provision can be integrated into the tools. In other cases, the black font presents some example language to provide a framework of a typical agreement or a typical policy. With regard to the model franchise agreement, we provide a typical agreement framework. We built the provisions of the agreement by using actual franchise provisions. We drew on about 20, more than 24, I think, different agreements throughout the state that included SB 1383 related provisions in them already. In cases where there wasn't example language that we could identify, we drafted some new provisions to fill those gaps. The model agreement is organized into two main documents. You've got the body of the agreement, which provides a lot of the general requirements, and the exhibits that provide more detailed specifications. Keep in mind that we've omitted some boilerplate language that would normally go into a franchise agreement, but was not specific to SB 1383, things like rate setting provisions or performance standards. We've designed the model agreement to be flexible so that a wide range of different communities and contracting arrangements could be accommodated within it. And as with all model tools, we've built in a fair bit of optionality. Where possible, we've given multiple example provisions in dozens of the sections throughout the model agreement, and those options will allow users to pick and choose the language that most closely fits their particular circumstances and desired compliance approach. This slide gives a little more detail on the model agreement. The collection system throughout the guidance notes and multitude of different optional contract provisions, we've attempted to address different types of 1383 compliant collection systems and services. For example, we address 3-stream, 3+ stream, 2-stream, and 1-stream systems, as well as split container systems and systems that use plastic and compostable bags. The collection approaches are reflective of the regulatory requirements and the different pathways in the regulations that are allowed. We include container requirements as it relates to SB 1383, where it specifies blue, green, and gray container combinations, and we offer approaches to phasing those in either immediately or over time as the law allows. The container information is provided in the context of the various 3, 2, or 1 container systems, and in terms of colors for split containers and food waste only containers. Services like bulky item collection and uncontainerized yard trimming collection have been included to demonstrate strategies for handling yard trimmings, cardboard, and other organics picked up through those programs in a manner that complies with SB 1383. Those organics must either be source separated and handled at an organic waste processing facility or collected with other non-organic material and processed at a high diversion organic waste processing facility. In terms of providing provisions for transfer, processing, and disposal services, we know this can be complicated. We've addressed scenarios where the hauler provides those services directly and specify the facilities in a way that meets the 1383 requirements. We also provide example language for scenarios where the jurisdiction takes responsibility for transfer, processing, or disposal through their own facilities or perhaps through other contracts. Example provisions are provided for various strategies to support 1383 compliance related to contamination monitoring, education, technical assistance, edible food recovery, waiver implementation, inspections, and enforcement. In many cases, the model agreement provides optional provisions that focus on consideration of different roles and responsibilities for the hauler and for the jurisdiction. For example, language is provided for jurisdictions that wish to conduct contamination monitoring themselves, but it's also provided for jurisdictions that wish to delegate those requirements to their hauler. For edible food recovery requirements, we've provided example provisions for ways that haulers can support edible food recovery. The waiver provisions in the model franchise cover two aspects of the 1383 regulations. First, provides provisions related to waivers for generators for de minimis, space-constrained, or collection frequency. Those waivers are allowed under 1383, but not specifically required, so jurisdictions can choose based on their decision about waivers, whether to include that or not. But it also provides guidance and options for jurisdictions that can secure from CalRecycle low population, high elevation, or rural jurisdiction waivers. The model agreement provides language describing the hauler's role in the compliance reviews required under SB 1383 and provides some optionality based on the jurisdiction's compliance approach, whether they're choosing a standard compliance or performance-based compliance. And lastly, while the model doesn't provide standard franchise fee provisions, it does identify some options for funding SB 1383 compliance and oversight. In particular, it includes example language for an SB 1383 fee and financial contributions to edible food recovery programs. Under SB 1383, jurisdictions are required to adopt an enforceable ordinance or other enforceable mechanisms to require generators and other entities to comply with the regulations. The model ordinance provides an example of how that can be accomplished. It pulls very heavily from the regulatory language, so users of the model will see a lot of blue font that illustrates the inclusion of the specific SB 1383 regulatory language. The definitions were largely pulled from SB 1383. Users of the model should customize those to fit their specific jurisdiction. Guidance notes are provided to assist users in doing so. For single family and commercial generators, the document is split between the requirements for single family generators, which includes multifamily less than 5 units, and commercial generators, which includes multifamily with 5 or more units. And the ordinance specifies that residents and businesses must subscribe to the jurisdiction's provided collection system and shall separate their organics and recyclables as instructed if applicable. It also provides options for residents and businesses to self-haul source separated organic waste to facilities that can process the materials or haul mixed waste to a high diversion facility. Under 1383, jurisdictions are to universally provide all customers with a compliant organics collection service automatically. This applies to both the standard compliance approach in Article 3 as well as the performance-based approach in Article 17. The ordinance requires customers' acceptance and participation in the collection services. This section includes some provisions that the jurisdiction can specify the service levels that customers have to ensure sufficient capacity and for adequate separation of organic materials. Model ordinance also includes 1383 requirements for businesses related to education, provision of containers indoors and outdoors, inspection of containers, and more. The regulations include 2 main types of waivers, as I described on the last slide, those provided to jurisdictions by CalRecycle and those provided by the jurisdiction to their generators. The first situation is addressed throughout the document in the guidance notes for where sections should be omitted or modified if the jurisdiction is exempt from certain requirements under the waiver granted by the department. The second option is addressed in Section 8 of the model ordinance, and it presents the de minimis physical space and collection frequency waivers that can be available to generators at the option of each jurisdiction. The section includes guidance that the waivers are optional, but that if the jurisdiction wishes to provide them, they should include language in that section which focuses mainly on the administrative processes for requesting and documenting the waivers. Note that under 1383, generators may be granted waivers in both the standard and performance-based compliance approaches. However, under performance-based compliance, jurisdictions need to be sure that 90% of residential generators and 90% of commercial generators all have the 3 container system, and those residential generators and commercial generators get measured separately. For commercial edible food generators, the regulations are fairly explicit about the exact requirements for those generators, and so this section largely reflects the regulatory language listing those requirements and the compliance timelines for Tier 1 and Tier 2. The model ordinance also provides a section that lists the requirements of edible food recovery organizations and services. These requirements, again, are pulled from the regulations and focused on the record keeping and reporting around edible food recovery. Guidance and options for additional language is provided there, depending on how you want to handle that record keeping and reporting locally. There's a section for haulers and self-haulers and focuses on the requirements for oversight of those actors. The guidance notes recognize that additional requirements may be placed on haulers such as education, contamination monitoring. However, this can be required in the franchise agreement and may not be required to be explicitly stated in detail in the model ordinance. Section on self-haulers lists the requirements for self-haulers, including specific record-keeping requirements for those commercial generators and commercial self-haulers. And again, this is the vehicle for regulating those folks, so that's where the specifications need to be. The CalGreen section requires building permit applicants to comply with certain CalGreen requirements related to providing adequate space for recycling in new buildings, as well as recycling organic waste commingled with C&D in order to achieve a 65% recovery rate. Jurisdictions may already have these C&D requirements in another ordinance or in existing policies. However, the C&D requirements are briefly included in this model for a holistic look at 1383 related to CalGreen. Similarly, with the Model Water Efficient Landscaping Ordinance, MWELO, the section lists the 1383 requirements that focus specifically on the state's MWELO. Those sections that are addressed in 1383 are related particularly to the use of compost and mulch in projects. Similar to CalGreen, jurisdictions may consider adding these requirements to a different section or may have already done so through existing ordinances or other enforceable mechanisms. Related to procurement, the model ordinance includes a section on recycled content paper and paper product procurement requirements for jurisdictions, departments, and vendors, but it's important to note that additional recovered organic waste product procurement requirements are covered in the model procurement policy, which we'll discuss in a minute. The inspection section of the model includes the legal framework that authorizes jurisdiction representatives to conduct required inspections under 1383. And the example enforcement section draws largely on the regulatory text for the procedures related to enforcement and penalties. An enforcement table is included to visually demonstrate the types of violations, which also denotes the differences in performance-based compliance. So while the model ordinance addresses some procurement-related items, the intention of the model ordinance is for the jurisdiction to establish enforcement requirements on regulated entities that are under the jurisdiction's authority, whereas jurisdictions would typically regulate their own internal processes, such as procurement, through an administrative policy. The model procurement policy is provided to support jurisdictions' integration of SB 1383 procurement requirements into their internal procurement policies. So it includes a recovered organic waste product procurement target, and this section of the policy states that the jurisdiction will procure recovered organic waste products that meet their annual target, which is a target that's determined by CalRecycle based on population. Note that while 1383 states that CalRecycle will notify the jurisdictions of the amount of their annual procurement target, jurisdictions do not need to wait for CalRecycle to provide this notice. They can simply calculate their procurement target at any time. It's 0.08 pounds per resident per year using DOF population data. The section of the model also identifies the types of products that the jurisdiction may use to meet the annual target, and that may be a combination of compost, mulch, renewable gas, and electricity from biomass plants. Each of these products must meet specific SB 1383 specifications to qualify. For example, they need to be generated in California. The model addresses product use by different service providers, so jurisdictions have the option to meet the annual procurement target of organic waste products through use of a direct service provider. The section provides examples for the types of provisions that could be included to meet the requirements and which types of direct service providers would be good options for achieving the targets. For example, jurisdictions may require landscapers to use 1383 eligible compost or mulch, or may require a hauler to provide 1383 eligible compost or mulch for the jurisdiction and or use renewable gas to fuel the collection fleet. Jurisdiction requirements to purchase recovered organic waste products are covered in the model. The model includes language to create a policy for all jurisdiction departments related to this procurement for each type of product. So there's one section for organic waste products and another section for recycled content paper and paper products. There are requirements for vendors. In addition to the model provisions that address procurement requirements for the departments of the jurisdiction, the section includes language that places requirements on any vendors for the jurisdiction, and that'll help ensure that the products purchased by the jurisdiction meet those requirements of SB 1383. Each section of the model policy includes some record-keeping requirement for each entity that's covered. That ensures that the jurisdiction has all of the information for SB 1383 reporting when they need to report it. There's also a section specifically on the record-keeping process specifying how all of the information will be kept and aggregated. And the model policy envisions utilizing some sort of department procurement liaison outlined in that section. It's an important step to ensuring that all the policies laid out are actually executed and records are collected. And sometimes, depending on the situation, this can be really difficult with multiple departments or hundreds of people potentially making purchases within a jurisdiction. All right, so the fourth model tool is the Model Food Recovery Agreement, and it provides the general agreement framework that can be tailored to specific users' needs and conditions. So to create the model agreement, we compiled examples of existing food recovery resources used by food recovery organizations around the state. We then built out the structure of the agreement, including identifying areas where optional provisions are needed to reflect different types of arrangements. And the model agreement is organized using a main body as well as the attachments for further details. We designed the agreement to be highly customizable, flexible, and adaptable for use by different recovery organizations and services and different commercial edible food generators across the state that are going to have different service approaches and unique needs. The model includes a variety of options that we were able to identify throughout the model in guidance notes, and things like the types of food that are accepted, which party transports the food, whether there are fees for service, and more. Those options are identified and explained in the document using those guidance notes as we used in the other tools. So this slide presents a little more detail on what to expect in the Model Edible Food Recovery Agreement. In particular, I'll highlight areas of the model where it includes optionality that allows for the contracting parties to tailor the agreement to their specific arrangements. The agreement provides language on which foods are acceptable, which foods are not acceptable, and it outlines the conditions for refusal of donated food. The section will likely be customized by the food recovery organizations and services to reflect the nature of their specific programs and what they do and don't want. The importance of food safety is addressed by including language that references the need to comply with local, state, and federal regulations, and guidance notes indicate that the parties can amend that section to add specific food safety practices. The model agreement also outlines how donated food will be collected, transported, and stored, and provides some optionality as to which party will do what. For example, in some cases, the agreement may note the food recovery organization picking up the food from the generator, and in other cases, the generator may be delivering it to the organization. So we've given optional provisions for either of those. Prohibition of donation dumping is covered in the agreement to protect the food recovery organizations that can't receive food that doesn't meet their needs. And there's also a section that's dedicated to equipment protocols. It includes options for food recovery service providers to provide the food storage bags or containers or coolers or whatever the vehicle is to do so. And then finally, we've built in some optionality into the model related to service fees and donation arrangements. And so whatever the business model is for the food recovery organization or service, we should have some framework there for them to work with. I think I've mentioned this several times now, but it's really important to note that these tools were designed to be highly customizable. Building in that customization features was a real priority for CalRecycle and for HF&H, recognizing that there's a real broad range of different systems and strategies among jurisdictions throughout the state. And there are a number of options built into the regulations about how agencies can comply. And so in our efforts, we tried as best we could to provide for as many of those different unique scenarios as possible and to provide you the guidance notes that you'll need to make adaptations for those. So let me note some important considerations to think about as you use the tools. So before you begin use of the model tools, you probably want to determine whether to use the model tool as a starting point or whether to amend existing agreements or policies or ordinances that you already have. For some sections on the model tools, it's recommended that users consider use of existing provisions. We say that specifically in the document, that there's a placeholder here and you should bring your boilerplate in, or you should bring existing provisions in and review them from an existing agreement. If you're amending an existing agreement, ordinance, or policy, we've provided example provisions in the model tools that you can then copy out and paste into your existing documents. As you use the model tools, you want to be sure to carefully review the definitions in the models and in your existing agreements, policies, and ordinances. And we'll go into this issue in a lot more detail in the other workshops this week about how those defined terms work and how you use them. But modification and alignment of those terms is going to be needed, and particular attention needs to be paid to the relationship of defined terms in SB 1383. This is a bit of a tedious process, but it's critical as the defined terms have a significant impact over the meaning of the various provisions in the agreement, in the ordinance, and obviously in the other tools. Each jurisdiction is responsible for understanding and complying with SB 1383. As we noted at the beginning of the presentation, the use of the model tools does not exempt a jurisdiction from complying with all of the requirements. You can't fulfill all requirements through the use of these tools or even through delegation to other entities, and so it's advised that jurisdictions thoroughly review the regulations, take necessary action to ensure full compliance, and seek guidance from experts if needed. In that vein, any agreement, policy, or ordinance that results from the use of the model tools should not be considered to have undergone legal counsel review. Each jurisdiction is responsible for involving its legal counsel to perform legal review and approval processes that are typically required by the jurisdiction for approval of such agreements, ordinances, and policies. While several attorneys have looked at these documents and given us great input on them, that does not replace your local counsel related to your specific conditions. When implementing new or amended agreements, ordinances, or policies, it's strongly advised to conduct stakeholder outreach and engagement to get input from the public. That's not a requirement of 1383, but good practice. And the provisions in the model tools are examples only. Jurisdictions are not required to use this language, nor are they required to include similar provisions in its relevant agreements, policies, and ordinances. All of this language should be considered in the context of the jurisdiction's local conditions, and customization and modification is expected to reflect those conditions. Through this project, HF&H developed a series of case studies for CalRecycle that spotlight how jurisdictions and entities are doing early implementation on some aspects of 1383, and we've got 2 case studies for each of the model tools. They're listed here on this slide, and they're available at the link shown on the bottom of the slide. I want to thank you all very much for joining us today and listening in, and we'll use the remaining time that we have to respond to any comments.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for your presentation. It went very well. As a reminder, for any questions, we're going to be accepting them live. So if you could please put an asterisk in the GoToWebinar chat feature, and you'll be called upon to unmute yourself when our folks here unmute you. So let me turn it over and see if there's any asterisks yet. There is one.
Hi, Colleen. I've unmuted you on our end, so please unmute yourself to ask your question.
Thank you, first of all, for this presentation and for all of the model tools. They're greatly appreciated and very helpful. I am curious in regards to, and I apologize, I have not had the time to go through the model tool for the sample agreements for food recovery organizations. But in your development of this agreement, did you consider alternative terminology to the word donation? The use of the word donation in food recovery creates an expectation by the donor that the food recovery service organization will provide that service free of charge. So I'm struggling around the word donation. I was wondering if you considered using other words within that sample agreement in order to encourage the ability of the food recovery agency to be able to charge for their services while maintaining tax protections for the donor.
Robert, Tracy, do you want to take that and then I could add on?
Sure. Yeah, good question, Colleen. Good morning. Yes, we looked at various models, and we were very sensitive to the fact that the enterprise model is probably going to be more common than a donation, quote unquote, model. We did build into the tool optionality for both approaches, but yeah, we were very sensitive and work closely with the food recovery organizations and services to understand, you know, that enterprise model needed to be built in here because that's likely how many of them will operate.
And then
Great, thank you so much.
And then one thing to note, Colleen, these are model tools, right? So they're highly customizable for your jurisdictions. So like Rob stated, you could customize these and just consult your legal counsel if you need to.
Just to review the protocol for asking questions, just if you have a question, just type an asterisk into the chat box, and then you'll be unmuted and invited to ask your question or provide your comment.
Hi, Colleen. I've unmuted you again. Please go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
If you have other people asking questions, they can go first. But if you're available, I figure I might as well ask it. So in regards to ordinance development, I have regularly heard that if an agency at least passes the ordinances prior to 2022, that will be seen somewhat as a substantial effort towards compliance, whether or not you have a full system in place. My concern and the concern raised from our legal team and code enforcement is adopting ordinances that the city or jurisdiction has no ability to fund or staff for implementation and enforcement. So basically adopting shell ordinances that we would not be able to fund and staff until much later. So this is in the scenario where a jurisdiction has not funded or staffed code enforcement officers or even the programmatic requirements related to that ordinance. So would that jurisdiction be found in a notice of violation, even though they've technically adopted the ordinance but are unable to implement it due to obvious limitations?
So Kara will take on this question.
Hi, Colleen. Thanks so much for your question. There's a lot in that question, so I probably won't hit on everything. But I think the main point that I'd like to make is in any particular situation, the first step for CalRecycle is to conduct a compliance evaluation. And that allows us to really get at what the issues are and if there are programmatic gaps. Also, in the compliance guidance document that CalRecycle sent out earlier this year, we clarified, added some clarification. One important point in that document is that we really are focused on compliance assistance first. So depending on what the funding issues are and the staffing issues are related to, it may be a situation where CalRecycle does not initiate enforcement action, as CalRecycle has discretion. So it's a little bit tough. Each jurisdiction may have a different situation and a reason for that. And the important thing is that CalRecycle would conduct that evaluation to understand what that situation is and determine the best course of action. Does that help answer your question, Colleen?
Yes, it does. It's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is with finalization of the rule happening soon or now, and the tools just getting released, the challenge is if I was to staff and get this program going, I need to have that request already in to go to budget for fiscal year 21, 22. And under a COVID world, a lot of jurisdictions are facing either a flatline budget request or even reductions.
Right,
so
right. Yeah.
The inability to staff these programs are concerning, even if we, you know, I might be able to pass an ordinance, but the actual ability to staff and implement that ordinance or to essentially enforce it if required requested to enforce it would be challenging.
Right, absolutely. And, I think CalRecycle certainly appreciates the incredible challenges that jurisdictions are facing right now. And that is really the purpose of getting out that guidance document and really emphasizing that, our first really focus and priority is compliance assistance. We recognize that there are jurisdictions that have significant staff reductions and funding issues right now. So I think, the important thing is for any jurisdiction in that situation, including you, Colleen, is to be communicating with CalRecycle and then really trying to, particularly as the COVID situation hopefully starts ending, that we really start developing what those timelines look like once you're able to, do the staffing that you need and better the timeline for passing the ordinance, et cetera. So again, each jurisdiction is going to be a bit different, and we need to have those conversations. And, really our goal is to assist jurisdictions to be in compliance and be implementing these programs. They're absolutely critical, as we all know, to dealing with our climate issue. And so there is a high priority to keep moving forward. With that in mind, CalRecycle understands the tremendous pressure and just challenge right now with all of our local jurisdictions. And so we're committed to be your partner through implementation, and particularly whether it's adopting the model ordinance as well as rolling out programs. We've had conversations with some jurisdictions that, right now they may not be able to pass the rates that they need to. So what they're doing is putting together a timeline on when they think they can approve those rates. Those are the kinds of conversations that we would like to have with jurisdictions as far as, what is our plan going forward as we have a better sense of what the situation is with COVID, when things might, start returning to some normalcy, and that's even going to take time just because of the economic situation that has resulted because of this pandemic. So I hope that answers your question. I hope that answers other jurisdictions who may have similar concerns. We just really would like to start those conversations with you and figure out what your timeline can be and, go from there.
All right, and the next question is from Kanya. Kanya, I've unmuted you, so you need to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Just to kind of piggyback a little bit on that, what Colleen stated, some of us won't know for a year or two, and what our economic is going to be because of sales tax reduction and what businesses are really going to continue to be here. So I appreciate the fact that CalRecycle wants to work with us and amend, our schedule and such, but we still may not know even a year from now, or 2 years from now, or possibly 3 years from now, what that's going to look like. So that's my one comment. The other comment is for the other presentations that are going to occur this week, I know that you're recording them. Will we have the ability to go back and rewatch it, or to have other staff who might, like our procurement or our finance people, to watch the presentations? Will those be made available?
Thank you for your comment. Yes, those will be available. So we're recording all 5 of our webinars, and we're going to be providing the PowerPoints as well. So once those are posted, we'll put them on our website and then message out through our listserv that they're available.
Thank you.
Hi, Christina and Marianne from Santa Cruz. I've unmuted you if you want to unmute yourself to ask your question. Okay, I will ask your question for you. So this is Mary Ann from Santa Cruz. Could we set up an ordinance to prevent food companies from throwing out day-old food instead of donating it? I know of 2 companies that threw out their day-old bread and pastry instead of donating. Thank you.
Robert Tracy, do you want to handle that, and then we could jump in?
Yeah, the model ordinance provides for requirements for those covered generators to donate what they can, there are obvious logistical issues when you get into working with the food recovery organizations and food recovery services about what they want and how much of certain things they can take. And for example, low nutritional value things like donuts and bagels and bread are things that they have some concerns about. They get a fair bit of already and often don't need as much as they already are getting. And so that particular item and other items are challenging for those organizations, but we've built in framework for it.
And Marianne, just to add on, it would also depend if they're tier 1 or tier 2 and covered under 1383. So if you would like, we'd be happy to work with you. And if you just want to contact us, we'd be happy to set up some time to chat.
Great. Our next question is from Heidi. I've unmuted you, so if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Okay, great. Can you guys hear me? Okay, thanks. So I'm with an organization that uses green waste as our hauler. And so in terms of organic material diversion from landfill, we currently use a single stream system, like pure single stream. We just have one trash unit, and then green waste separates all organic waste, recyclables, and trash. I know you guys mentioned blue containers, green and gray, and that's very common, but we have a very unique situation. So our diversion rate is super high. It ranges between 75 to 85%. What is the model, or what does the regulation say about our case?
HF&H, would you like to take this on first, and then we'll chime in?
Tracy, you are the processing guru. Why don't you jump in?
Well, I guess first I'd like to share that the regulations do allow for 3-container, 2-container, and 1-container system as you're describing. And as a result, the model franchise agreement includes, as Rob says, tremendous amount of optionality. And you will find language in the model tools, as in the model franchise, as well as in the model ordinance that cover 3, 2, and 1-container systems. And what it specifically requires about the 1-container system in alignment with the regulations is that those materials that are collected in that 1-container or gray container have to be transported to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. And then there's standards within the processing requirements that high diversion organic waste processing facility needs to recover 50% of the organic waste materials. And that's your green, your food, and all your papers and cardboard by January 1, 2022, and up to 75% by January 1, 2025. And there's specific protocols I know the state's working on how exactly that's going to be measured to determine whether or not those facilities achieve those recovery rates. And I think the really key thing to realize is while you're talking about diversion overall for the facility, the regs focus on this 50 and 75% as diversion of the organic waste in the waste stream. So I don't know if Kara or Ashley wants to add anything, or Rob, feel free to do so.
No, I think you nailed it. Heidi, did we answer your question?
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. And so it sounds like it's the responsibility of both us as an organization and our hauler to ensure that our organizational waste is being diverted to standard. And currently it is from the data we receive, but we can dig in further and just make sure there's compliance there. And it sounds like if there's not, we need to go to our hauler and say, okay, then we need to start separating to increase the diversion. Thank you guys, that was really helpful.
All right, our next question is from Marie. Her question is, do the tools provide guidance on how to identify Tier 1 generators for edible food recovery? In particular, how does a jurisdiction identify which food distributors are included? Are food manufacturers included? Or companies like HelloFresh or Blue Apron that deliver food directly to customers?
Robert,
Tracy. So the model tools do not give you guidance specifically on how to go about analyzing your commercial generator base. They're just focused on defining the tier 1 and tier 2 generators. I don't know if CalRecycle has any tools in the works to give more specifics about that.
Perfect. That's a great question, Marie. So we are doing a couple things with our edible food side. Our edible food team is putting together a toolkit that will help jurisdictions probably provide examples of what the tier 1 and tier 2s are. Also, something that we're doing, and it's very exciting, is we're doing an edible food capacity planning calculator. So that's scheduled to come out early next year. And that will actually help you guys determine capacity for your tier 1, tier 2 once they're identified.
Okay, Cynthia, you have the next question. I've unmuted you, so if you unmute.
Hi, everybody.
Okay.
Hi, Kara. Hey, so we've been working in the field. We've actually been flipping lids the last couple of months just to get an idea, and then just getting an idea of what our different jurisdictions are looking at. We have a jurisdiction that reminds me of San Francisco, where everything's up and down a hill. All the black carts, because that's all they can give them, sit on the sidewalk, and just barely enough so if it's a property with 16 carts, it's sitting on the property on the sidewalk. So I know we can't give them any additional bins, so they're going to have to do the single bin. But when I flip these lids, I'm not finding, first of all, there's no green waste. There's zero green waste. It's all concrete. But when I flip these lids, I'm not finding any food waste at all, because their containers are just big enough to provide for the residents. So this is going to be a tier 2? I'm a little confused about that. And also I want to ask you about the waivers for these situations, because we're talking thousands and thousands of accounts that are in a really tight area of Los Angeles. Does that make sense? You guys are looking at each other.
I'm giggling, Cynthia. Sort of, Cynthia, probably, yeah, no, I think probably to be helpful to do a follow-up to better understand the situation. I think a couple things, particularly for the waivers, the de minimis waivers do allow if a generator, so the regulations speak to commercial businesses. And I missed that. Are we talking about residents or commercial businesses?
Multifamily, by the way.
Oh,
These are
multifamily. Okay, great. So de minimis waivers potentially could be issued. I guess the question is kind of where that food waste is going. If truly it's a de minimis amount, then the waiver could be utilized. So I think, Cynthia, for this one, it'd be great to have a follow-up so my team can better understand and we can look at the situation and figure out what makes most sense for this one.
I'm actually going to take some pictures and send to you, because
Perfect.
it's something I'm actually losing sleep over, believe it or not, because, I want to be able to help my client. But this, all the other ones are pretty easy to figure out.
Yeah.
But this one, I keep on thinking, I haven't been to San Francisco a long time, but these are on a hill. They're so tight. There's no room for extra carts.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know how the hauler even gets on the street to pick up what they can. But these are on crazy streets. Everything's on the sidewalk, and I can't see them getting any additional containers, and I see no food waste.
Okay. Let's follow up, Cynthia.
And you know what's making it awful hard, really, really hard, one more thing, folks, is everybody is at home. With COVID, everybody is at home right now. So I don't know what it's going to look like in the next year, but as of today, for us to do these audits, it's very dangerous because there's no parking. And to even us for flipping lids, it's a lot of work. So I just wanted to give you that insight. We're actually out there, but because we can't find any parking, it's tough. So anyways, I will take pictures and send them to you, and I'd like some feedback. I was thinking the waivers, otherwise, this hauler is going to have a mixture of carts. They're going to have the dual carts, one green and then just all black, I guess, or whatever the color is going to be.
Yeah, let's definitely do a follow-up. And I was just in San Francisco yesterday on a scooter, so we can talk about that to help you get around. I'm just kidding.
No.
You know my friend.
Major clutch.
All right, Colleen, you're up. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you so much. And this question might apply more to the webinar on food recovery later in the week. But just to kind of start the discussion, food recovery, and one of the people asked the question earlier about, sugary breads, donuts, etc. Food recovery, I see it as not just being food recovery for the food insecure. It could include value-added processing. For example, I know of a vendor that takes day-old sweets and turns it into vodka. So if we were to develop a way in the language that would encourage and allow this, would we have challenges with exclusivity with franchises, right? How recycling could take precedence over value-added processing. I know there's some issues surrounding animal feed as well. I'm trying to shorten this question as much as possible, but I'm concerned about the fact that the way it's currently set up, that we're just promoting food donation to food insecure. We're not actually promoting as well value-added processing of food product before even thinking of animal feed or recycling/composting.
Yeah, Colleen, thank you so much for that question. I think that's one that we need to noodle with our legal team as far as collecting edible food that then is used, and I'm very familiar with the company that you're talking about that makes the vodka. So we'll have to think about that, and we'll do a follow-up with you as well as with everyone. We'll probably create some follow-up information for folks. Thank you so much for your question.
I'll just add one thing to that. In the model franchise agreement, under the limitations of scope section is where you typically have a whole laundry list of things that your franchise hauler or non-exclusive franchise hauler does not have rights to collect. Like people can self-haul, or materials incidental to construction services or landscaping can be taken. We don't provide a full section on that. It's very specific to each jurisdiction, but we do provide a couple of examples that jurisdictions may want to consider, including going forward. And one does relate to food and beverage products being used for animal feed purposes. So there is an example provision that you can consider. It really depend on your negotiation with your haulers, or if you're going out for a new agreement, whether or not you can, craft that and integrate it into your documents.
Thank you. And just to clarify, it's not just vodka. I know the food recovery team at SB 1383 did such a good job in changing the language and the rule to just focus on edible food and less on food insecurity. So I think any assistance to add model language to encourage value-added processing, for food product, right? Because that's the highest and best use of a food product prior to animal feed and then composting. So thank you.
All right, Angela, I've unmuted you. If you unmute yourself, you can ask your question now.
Thank you and good morning. My question is, so I'm in a city in Northern California, and like many others, we do host in typical times a weekly afternoon, evening farmers markets with food trucks, and it's a party for our local community. And so I was wondering what guidance and resources there are about meeting the food recovery mandates and how that would relate to the many different farmers market vendors that we would be bringing together weekly.
Tracy or Rob, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I guess my first reaction is that each individual vendor is probably not of a sufficient scale or size to be a tier 1 or tier 2 generator. And so your choice to engage them in the food recovery efforts would be discretionary on your part. Great place to start and would give some visibility to the program, I'm sure, but I don't think those would be cover generators under the definitions.
Very helpful information. Thank you for that kind of initial guidance. I appreciate that.
Adrina, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Perfect, thank you. I know you guys were talking about the edible food toolkits and the capacity planning calculator. You said the capacity planning calculator will be coming out early next year. Do you have a time frame of when that'll be given to the public?
So hopefully within the first quarter, no later than the second quarter of next year. And then also as a side note, we are revamping our 1383 website. So once the regulations are finalized, you'll see a brand new website for 1383 on CalRecycle's website, which include FAQs, other edible food tools, and other things that we're developing right now. So right now there's about 3 or 4 pages dedicated to 1383. On our website, we're probably developing around 20 right now. So those will be launched right when the regulations get approved.
Michelle, I've unmuted your line, so if you unmute yourself, you could ask your question. Looks like you have your hand raised.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for this series. I'm looking forward to seeing all of the the presentations. What I'm wondering in all of these presentations that I've heard so far, you all have been so gracious about saying follow up with us and get in touch with us. Do you, especially CalRecycle, I think, have any guidance on who and how we should be contacting CalRecycle for the various questions that we have, so we're sort of using your resources wisely?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, your first go-to should be your jurisdiction's local assistance and market development liaison. That liaison will make sure that any questions that you have are routed to the appropriate team members. Julia Doloff on our team manages those questions. We have a pretty quick turnaround time for follow-up, so that is the way to go. If you don't want to use that as an option, you're also welcome to send your questions to the SLCP inbox, and we will also manage getting back to you quickly that way as well. So two ways you can go.
Thanks for everything you guys are doing on both teams. Okay, thanks.
Karen, I see you have your hand raised. You can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Yes, if it's been mentioned before, I apologize, but and it ties in with Cynthia's question regarding waivers. So in a jurisdiction where because trash enclosures were built before before AB 939, they're small and they don't have enough room for additional containers, especially in the commercial district. So how does the waiver process allow cities to deal with that situation where they've got a number of businesses that don't have the room to provide the to have room for organic waste containers? Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for your question. Rob or Tracy, do you want to take that on, and then we'll chime in?
In terms of the models, we've built language in that will allow you to affect those policies if you choose to grant waivers for your jurisdiction. As to which space constraint waivers CalRecycle would accept and which they might look askance at, I will turn back to Kara and Ashley for that.
Thank you, Rob. To Rob's point, that's exactly correct. If we are seeing that a jurisdiction is issuing, say, a large number of physical space waivers, we're going to conduct a compliance evaluation and to just evaluate what the situation is. Are those waivers warranted? How long are those waivers needing to be in place so that, particularly with space issues, we do expect that space issues would be something that a jurisdiction would be working towards addressing, so that generator hopefully is looking to problem solve. Maybe they can't do it immediately, but we wouldn't expect a space waiver to stay in place for a significantly long time. I'm not setting any time frame to that. So it would definitely be a follow-up that we would do with a jurisdiction if we're starting to see a lot of waivers, basically to understand the reason and what the need is and how that need is being addressed. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Well, and a quick follow-up. So if the expectation is that the jurisdiction is supposed to be working towards fixing the space problem, will there be any funding to help jurisdictions with or jurisdictions and the property owners to create the space?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's not any specific funding right now with respect to enclosures and whatnot. The degree to which, when we're talking about recycling and beverage containers, I'm not even sure that the beverage container program would allow for enclosures, but that's something you could explore with your grant manager. But unfortunately, right now, there isn't that funding. So, that's another good example of why time might be needed to deal with a space issue. And so we would work closely with you on those situations.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is from Caitlin. I've unmuted you, so if you'll unmute your phone, you can ask your question. All right, I'm going to read your question. Does the Office of Administrative Law have 30 business or calendar days to finalize the regulations?
Thanks for the question, Caitlin. So in regards to the Office of Administrative Law, or OAL, under normal circumstances, they would do an expedited review on the resubmittal, so quicker than 30 working days. However, the timeline was extended due to the executive orders signed earlier this year because of COVID. So while we don't have an exact time frame for the decision, OAL does understand the urgency of this rulemaking package. So once we hear from OAL, we will notify all of our stakeholders through our listserv.
Manuel, I've unmuted you, so if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, can you folks hear me? Awesome. I was just wondering if the waivers will be made available in Q1 2021, or when they will be available. We're just interested in looking at those and seeing the language and how it relates to our jurisdiction.
I'll start. I mean, the language is in the regulations right now. It describes the de minimis waiver criteria. There's 2 thresholds. If there's 2 cubic yards or more of solid waste, you have to generate less than 20 gallons of organic materials per container, meaning like the green container or the blue for the papers and the cardboard. And that's for commercial businesses, which would include multifamily. There's another threshold if that entity generates less than 2 cubic yards of solid waste, then the criteria is actually 10 gallons or less of organic materials in either the green or the blue container. They would be eligible for the de minimis waiver. There's also the language around the physical space waiver, and it does include some specific criteria on who can sign off on allowing for that physical space waiver to be granted. So I think you'll find all the language is there in the regulations, and then we've included that language also in the model franchise agreement, as well as administrative procedures about how the hauler might support a jurisdiction in managing that waiver process, and the re-verification that occurs. So there's actually a good bit of optionality there. And I think the important things for jurisdictions to remember is they do not have to offer those waivers. That's entirely optional. If a jurisdiction doesn't want to allow for physical space or de minimis, they do not have to do so. So those are optional provisions.
Thank you for that. We were wondering about the low population. Maybe they're not called waivers, but that specifically.
I'll go ahead and respond to that. Thank you for clarifying. So we have a team that will be starting soon to develop the waiver process. The waiver process is very straightforward. It is laid out in the regulations as far as what the threshold criteria are. It also provides in the regulations what a jurisdiction will have to provide to CalRecycle. With that said, however, we do plan to create kind of what that application will look like. But again, it will follow extremely, it will align exactly with the regulations. I don't have a timeline yet. We are planning on starting to accept waivers in around September 21. That may change depending on feedback we get from jurisdictions. I am hopeful that our team, just planning-wise, we should have the process, what will be asked, et cetera, probably sometime around second quarter or third quarter of 21. But again, the team hasn't really gotten going yet, so I'll know more after that. If you want to follow up with me directly, Kara Morgan, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can put a tickler on my calendar to get back to you. But regardless, we'll be sending information out to all jurisdictions as we develop the CalRecycle approved waiver process. But you can be assured that what you see in the regulations is what it will entail. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and then the other thing I wanted to mention particularly on the low population waivers, as we know, we are going through the updated census for 2020. We have seen on the census website that they expect the census data to be out in April-ish of 2020. So it would be really important if you are considering a low population waiver, whether it's for a city or an unincorporated area. It will be important that you utilize that 2020 data, as that is what CalRecycle would be utilizing as well. Doesn't mean to say you couldn't look at the 2019 data and have a good idea of whether your area would qualify or not. But again, keep in mind you should be using the 2020 census data.
This is Tracy again. One last note. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were talking about the low population and high elevation. I will say that the model ordinance and the model franchise both address this scenario as well. So for example, if you're in a county that has some pockets that qualify for the low population or high elevation, there is language about what those areas need to specifically accomplish in terms of the collection programs and compliance programs through the ordinance. So you'll find example language there if you fit into those categories.
All right, David, I have unmuted you. So if you have a question, you can ask it now after you unmute yourself. I'll go ahead and read Dave's question. Is CalRecycle developing an organics facility processing capacity calculator?
Great question, Dave. So we are developing our organics process or capacity planning calculator. That calculator also is planned to be released the same time the edible food calculator is being released. So either first quarter of 2021 at the latest second quarter of 2021, as long as technology agrees with us.
All right, this question is from Marie. Are liquor stores or convenience stores that exceed 10,000 square feet or $2 million in sales technically covered as Tier 1 generators for edible food recovery? Would they receive a waiver?
Thanks for your question, Marie. So convenience stores were actually taken out of the regulations on one of our drafts. So they would not be a Tier 1 or Tier 2.
All right, Colleen, you're unmuted for your next question.
All right, well, I better hurry because I got to jump into a meeting as I am developing a franchise agreement for SB 1383 today. But I'm sorry, I need to speak about waivers in particular. I really hope in future presentations or tools or your website on waivers that CalRecycle makes the effort to clearly indicate the liability of certain waivers and the cost associated with certain waivers, and kind of the reality of it. Physical space waivers, I think the majority of California urban environment would qualify as a physical space waiver. I mean, a house the size of a trash enclosure in my community could be close to $1 million in value. So, having that kind of open-ended aspect of waivers by this regulation is extremely challenging for jurisdictions. I acknowledge that you say jurisdictions could, deny waivers as part of the state regulation, but usually that's used as a weapon by our customers, for a jurisdiction to go harder than the most comprehensive state regulation, over the past 30 years is kind of a tough sell when customers just do not want to have organics recycling services. So, and especially in an environment where, building a trash enclosure means, one less townhome or one less commercial tenant. So I really hope future education can focus on some of the challenges associated and help give justification to back the jurisdictions that cannot, really implement these waivers. So I guess that's a comment more than a question. So thank you for the discussion on this. I appreciate today's webinar. Thank you.
Colleen, thanks so much. We have that noted, and we may be connecting with you to get more information, but we'd be happy to provide as much guidance we can on the waivers.
All right, Jennifer, I've unmuted you, so go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there, thank you. My question is, since they were talking about waivers, specifically, will CalRecycle be creating a tool to measure the organic waste generated from a business, particularly from like a desktop? We utilized under 1826 a generator ID tool that CalRecycle once developed that helped us kind of make these determinations without physically being at the business. And so I was wondering if under 1383 a tool be created, or if there's any opportunity for something such as that. It will help with our limited resources.
Hey, Jennifer, thanks for your suggestion. We haven't necessarily thought of developing a tool. We've had some feedback about some help with a visual on what 10 and 20 gallons looks like. So the team may be looking at that, but I'll take your note down, and the waiver team may do a follow-up with you to get some more ideas. It is a little bit difficult and challenging, I think, to do something not in person when it comes to the waivers. So I don't know the degree to which we can really come up with something when it comes to de minimis waivers and physical space. But we'll do some thinking on that, and the team hasn't gotten going yet. But if you have any additional specific ideas, feel free to shoot them our way.
Great, thank you.
All right, Cynthia, I've unmuted you. If you unmute yourself, you can ask what will probably be our last question today. I'll go ahead and read Cynthia's question. What is the status regarding carpet and mattress recycling under SB 1383?
So Cynthia, let us know if we're not hitting on what you were after, but the regulations speak specifically to particularly carpet and textiles. Mattresses, as you know, is under an EPR program, carpet as well. And so we are going to have some frequently asked questions that will be published on the website after the regs are approved that talk about this. But in particular, through the regulatory process, in engaging with stakeholders, we felt that the existing EPR programs are really important as far as collecting these materials, and therefore we do not require these materials to be collected in the curbside collection program. And that's where you'll see in both the 3-container and 2-container as well as single and segregated sections of the regulations, that those are not required to be collected. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to let us know, but we'd like to see these materials continue to make their way through the EPR collection program instead of curbside. However, if a jurisdiction, for example, chooses to collect textiles at curbside, the regulations do provide for that as an option, but it's not required.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. So we're almost out of time, so I would just like to close the webinar out. So if there are any other questions or comments or clarity that you need, please, like Kara mentioned, feel free to contact your local assistance and market development representative. If you don't have one, or if you want to just email the SLCP inbox, you're more than welcome to. I would like to thank Rob and Tracy for putting on this webinar and hosting, and all the other consultants as well who contributed to the model tools. And just as a friendly reminder, tomorrow we have the model franchise agreement webinar at 10 o'clock. And then in the afternoon at 1 o'clock, we have the model enforcement ordinance, or the model mandatory organics disposal reduction ordinance. It's a mouthful to say, but that is at 1 o'clock tomorrow. So again, like Rob mentioned earlier, we'll be going more in depth on those tool models tomorrow. And then the next day we'll have procurement and edible food. So thank you all. Hope you have a great day and a happy Monday.